Picture a room you'll never see. No cameras, no journalists, just 10 people around a polished table in Manhattan, making decisions that will ripple through your life in ways you'll never trace back to this moment. One of them just approved a media acquisition that will shape what millions believe about climate change. Another is strategizing how to defeat labor legislation that would raise wages for their workers. A third is calculating the return on a political donation that will influence the next Supreme Court appointment. They're not elected. You didn't vote for them. Most people couldn't pick them out of a lineup. But their names appear again and again in banking crises and pharmaceutical scandals, in the fine print of legislation that passes at midnight, in the boards of think tanks that write policy papers, in the donor lists that decide elections, in the mastheads of media empires that frame how we see the world. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a pattern, one you can trace through court documents, financial filings, and investigative journalism, a pattern of wealth so vast it creates its own gravity, bending policy, media, and politics toward a handful of family names. 5 families, billions of dollars, connections spanning 3 generations. One controls what you watch and read. Another shapes the laws that govern your workplace. A third funded the data operation that may have influenced your vote. A fourth created an epidemic that killed hundreds of thousands. A fifth turned retail dominance into a political machine. They're not villains in a movie. They're names in the public record, documented, verified, and largely unknown to the people whose lives they shape. This is the story of how wealth becomes power, and how power, once concentrated, protects itself. Let's follow the money. There's a pattern in American history that repeats like clockwork. Every major economic transformation creates a new class of almost unimaginable wealth. And once that wealth concentrates, it doesn't just sit in bank accounts. It reorganizes society around itself. The late 1800s gave us the first version. Rockefeller controlled 90% of America's oil. Carnegie owned the steel that built the railroads. P. Morgan could single-handedly stop financial panics, or start them. These men didn't just run companies. They shaped legislation, controlled newspapers, and handpicked senators back when senators weren't even elected by popular vote. Then came the trust busters. Teddy Roosevelt broke up monopolies. Progressive reformers demanded regulation. For a few decades, the playing field leveled, slightly, but wealth has a memory, and it has lawyers. The families we're examining today emerge from a different transformation, the shift from making things to moving money, from factories to finance, from products you could touch to derivatives you couldn't explain, and they learned from history. They didn't build monopolies the government could break up. They built networks the government couldn't even see. Here's how modern dynastic power works. You don't need to own everything, you need to own enough. A media empire here, a political network there, board seats on 12 companies that look independent but share 36 directors. Foundations that fund research, supporting policies that benefit your industries. Think tanks that provide the intellectual cover for deregulation. Then you add the legal architecture. Trusts that shield wealth across generations. Shell corporations that obscure ownership. Campaign finance laws with loopholes you can drive a super PAC through. A tax code so complex that armies of accountants find ways to pay lower rates than middle-class families. The revolving door does the rest. Your company's lawyer becomes a federal judge. Your lobbyist becomes a senator's chief of staff. A regulator at the EPA spends 5 years approving your permits, then takes a 7-figure job at your firm. It's not corruption in the traditional sense. No briefcases of cash, no smoking guns. It's just how business gets done. What makes today different from Rockefeller's era isn't the concentration of wealth. It's the sophistication of the system protecting it. Carnegie couldn't donate unlimited money to political campaigns and call it free speech. Rockefeller couldn't own the media outlets covering his monopoly. Morgan couldn't use computer algorithms to influence elections. The families we're about to examine aren't robber barons, they're something more complex. Dynastic networks operating at the intersection of finance, politics, and media in an era when those 3 spheres have never been more interconnected. And unlike the moguls of the Gilded Age, they've learned to stay out of the spotlight until you start reading court documents. The Koch story starts where most American fortunes do, with oil and a willingness to work with anyone who'll pay. Fred Koch made his first real money in the 1930s, helping Joseph Stalin build oil refineries. Yes, that's Stalin. When American companies wouldn't hire him, Koch took his engineering expertise to the Soviet Union, trained Soviet engineers, then came home and spent the rest of his life as a founding member of the John Birch Society, warning about the communist threat. The irony was apparently lost on him. But Fred's Soviet contracts gave him the capital to build what would become Koch Industries. By the time he died in 1967, he'd built a substantial oil refining operation. His sons Charles and David turned it into the second largest private company in America. Today, Koch Industries is everywhere you don't see it. They refine oil, manufacture chemicals, process food, make the Dixie cups at your office and the Lycra in your clothes, extract resources, trade commodities. Annual revenue, over $100 billion. Combined family wealth, north of $100 billion. But the Koch fortune isn't what makes this family historically significant. Plenty of families have oil money. What makes the Kochs different is what they built with it, the most sophisticated political influence operation in American history. It started in the 1970s. Charles Koch had a problem. He wanted to run his businesses with minimal government interference, but Americans kept voting for environmental regulations, labor protections, and taxes on the wealthy. Democracy, from his perspective, wasn't working. So he set out to change what Americans believed, not through elections, through ideas. He funded libertarian think tanks, academic programs, research centers. The Cato Institute, which he co-founded in 1977, produces studies questioning environmental science and celebrating deregulation. The Mercatus Center at George Mason University became known as the most important think tank you've never heard of, shaping regulatory policy from inside the academic establishment. Then came the political machine. In 2004, Charles and David Koch began organizing donor summits, private gatherings where wealthy conservatives would pool resources for political campaigns. By 2015, the Koch network announced plans to spend nearly $900 million on the 2016 election cycle. That's almost as much as the Republican and Democratic parties combined. The crown jewel was Americans for Prosperity, founded in 2004. It looks like a grassroots movement, local chapters, town halls, rallies. But tax filings tell a different story. The Koch network provided the funding, the training, the talking points. When the Tea Party emerged in 2009, seemingly spontaneous, Americans for Prosperity was there, organizing it, busing people to protests, providing the signs and the speakers. This wasn't democracy. It was theater funded by billionaires. The policy results are documented. The Koch network fought climate legislation, helping kill cap-and-trade proposals. They pushed for tax cuts that disproportionately benefited the wealthy and got them in 2017. They funded campaigns against unions, minimum wage increases, and healthcare expansion. State by state, their model legislation, written by their network, became law. But there's a darker side in the court records. Koch Industries has racked up environmental violations that read like a crime blotter. In 1999, a federal jury found them guilty of covering up illegal releases of benzene, a carcinogen. They paid a $30 million fine. In 2000, they were charged with covering up oil spills in 6 states, 300 million gallons of crude oil. They settled for $35 million. In Corpus Christi, Texas, state health officials investigated a cancer cluster near a Koch refinery. Local families watched their children get sick. The company fought the investigation. Eventually, they paid settlements, admitted to no wrongdoing, and kept operating. When David Koch died in 2019, obituaries focused on his philanthropic donations, the $100 million to MIT, the Lincoln Center renovation. What they mentioned less, his fortune came from industries that actively fought environmental science, and his political network spent decades ensuring the regulations that might have protected communities near his refineries never materialized. Charles Koch is still alive, still funding the network. In recent years, he's softened his public image, talking about bridging divides, finding common ground. The funding tells a different story. The same organizations, the same causes, the same policies benefiting the same industries. Here's what makes the Koch operation so effective. It doesn't look like corruption. No one's stuffing cash in envelopes. It's think tanks producing white papers. It's academic research. It's grassroots organizing. It's campaign contributions protected as free speech. It's the transformation of wealth into an ecosystem of influence so vast, so interconnected, that it's become almost indistinguishable from the political landscape itself. And it all started with one question. What if you could use a fortune to change not just laws, but the ideas that shape laws? The Kochs found the answer, and the blueprint they created, other families would follow. If the Kochs discovered how to buy political influence, Rupert Murdoch figured out something more powerful, how to manufacture it. The story begins in 1952 when 21-year-old Rupert inherited a small newspaper in Adelaide, Australia, after his father's death. One newspaper. Within 2 decades, he'd owned most of Australia's press. The formula was simple. Buy struggling papers, slash costs, pump up the sensationalism, and watch circulation soar. High-minded journalism was expensive. Outrage was profitable. In 1969, Murdoch crossed to Britain and bought News of the World, a scandal sheet that specialized in sex, crime, and royals. Then The Sun, which he transformed into a tabloid phenomenon with topless models on page 3 and headlines that screamed rather than informed. Critics called it gutter journalism. Murdoch called it giving people what they wanted. His papers helped elect Margaret Thatcher in 1979. She, in turn, let him expand his empire. But Britain was just practice. America was the prize. As citizen in 1985 for one reason. American law prohibited foreigners from owning television networks. Within months, he launched Fox Broadcasting. In 1996, he created Fox News, putting Roger Ailes, Richard Nixon's former media consultant, in charge. The mission was explicit. Ailes saw liberal bias everywhere in American media. Fox would be different. Fair and balanced, the slogan promised. What it actually became was the most successful partisan media operation in American history. Not news shaped by ideology, but ideology packaged as news. By 2020, Fox News was the most watched cable news network in America, reaching millions of viewers nightly. Murdoch also owned the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and through News Corp, hundreds of publications globally. One family controlling the information flow to hundreds of millions of people across 3 continents. That's not media ownership, that's message control. And Murdoch used it. His papers in Britain crusaded for Brexit. His network in America became effectively state television during certain presidencies, with anchors texting directly with the president, shaping coverage to match administration messaging. Prime ministers and presidents didn't just court Murdoch's endorsement, they feared his opposition. Tony Blair flew to Australia to meet him before running for office. Donald Trump called him regularly for advice. When you own the microphone, politicians come to you. But the real story of the Murdoch empire is what happened when the methods got too brazen and the courts started opening files. In 2011, the news of the world was exposed for hacking thousands of phone lines. Celebrities, politicians, even murdered children and their grieving families. Journalists accessed voicemails to get scoops. Private investigators bribed police officers for information. It wasn't rogue reporters. Internal emails showed editors knew, encouraged it, deleted evidence. The scandal forced Murdoch to shut down News of the World, a paper that had been publishing for 168 years. He flew to London and took out full-page ads apologizing. "We are sorry," the ads read. But the Leveson inquiry, a judicial investigation into press ethics, revealed a culture of corruption that ran through his British operations. Rupert and his son James were called before Parliament. Rupert, 80 years old, claimed ignorance. "This is the most humble day of my life," he said. During his testimony, a protester threw a pie at him. His wife leapt up to protect him. It became the image of the scandal, a media mogul reduced to dodging foam. But here's the thing about Murdoch. Scandals don't stop him. They're just costs of doing business. The phone hacking settlements cost hundreds of millions. Executives went to jail. The company paid, rebuilt, rebranded, and moved on. Because when you control major media outlets, you control the narrative about your own scandals. Fox News barely covered Murdoch's British problems. His newspapers defended him, attacked his critics, and waited for the cycle to move on. It always does. Then came Fox News' own reckoning. In 2016, Roger Ailes, the man Murdoch had empowered for 2 decades, was forced out after multiple sexual harassment allegations. Documents revealed a culture of abuse, with Fox paying tens of millions in settlements to keep women quiet. In 2017, star host Bill O'Reilly was pushed out after the New York Times revealed Fox and O'Reilly had paid 5 women $13 million to settle harassment claims. Murdoch expressed concern. The network paid settlements and kept printing money because outrage is profitable, whether it's outrage about politics or outrage about the network itself. Fox's ratings barely dipped. Advertisers came back. The machine kept running. In 2019, Murdoch sold most of Fox's entertainment assets to Disney for $71 billion. But he kept Fox News and Fox Business, the cash cow, the influence engine, now run by his son Lachlan, while James, who reportedly disagreed with Fox's political direction, walked away. The Murdoch empire today is smaller but more focused. Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the Sun, Sky News Australia, a global conservative media infrastructure all singing from the same hymnal, all owned by one family. Rupert Murdoch is 93 now, but his creation will outlast him, a media empire that proved you don't need to control every outlet. You just need to control enough to shift the window of what's considered acceptable, what's debatable, what's true. The Kochs bought think tanks to shape ideas. Murdoch realized something more efficient. Own the platforms where ideas become reality in the public mind. And unlike academic papers, people actually watch television. Sam Walton opened his first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas in 1962 with a simple pitch. Low prices, every day. Nothing fancy. Just cut costs to the bone and pass some savings to customers. It worked. By the time he died in 1992, he'd built the largest retail chain in America. Today, the Walton family is the richest family in the United States. Combined wealth, over $200 billion. More than Jeff Bezos, more than Elon Musk, more than Bill Gates. And unlike tech billionaires who made their fortunes in a decade, the Waltons have been extracting wealth from the American economy for 60 years. Walmart isn't just big, it's a force of nature. Over 10,000 stores globally, 2.3 million employees, making it the largest private employer on earth. 1 in every 100 working Americans works for Walmart. Their revenue, more than $600 billion annually, exceeds the GDP of most countries. That scale creates power that goes far beyond retail. When Walmart enters a town, local businesses close. Not because Walmart is better, because it's bigger. They negotiate lower prices from suppliers by threatening to cut them off from the largest retail platform in the world. Small manufacturers either accept Walmart's terms or lose access to American consumers. It's not a negotiation, it's an ultimatum. The jobs Walmart creates replace the jobs it destroys, but at lower wages. The locally owned hardware store that paid $15 an hour with benefits becomes a Walmart, paying $11 an hour with part-time schedules designed to avoid benefit requirements. The family that owned that hardware store, their wealth, accumulated over generations, vanishes. The Waltons get richer. This is extraction disguised as efficiency. And the Waltons have used that wealth to reshape policy in their favor. According to Open Secrets, Walmart has spent over $60 million on federal lobbying since 1998. Their priorities: fighting minimum wage increases, opposing healthcare mandates, blocking labor organizing, and maintaining the tax structures that allow them to shift profits offshore. The Walton Family Foundation, with over $8 billion in assets, funds education reform, specifically charter schools and school choice initiatives that redirect public education funding to private operators. It's presented as philanthropy, but when you trace the outcomes, you find public school systems weakened, teacher unions undermined, and education increasingly run like a business, the same business model Walmart perfected in retail. But the real story is in the court documents. In 2001, 6 current and former Walmart employees filed a lawsuit alleging systematic gender discrimination. Betty Dukes, a 54-year-old greeter in California, described being passed over for promotions, paid less than male colleagues, and punished when she complained. The case grew into the largest employment discrimination lawsuit in history, representing 1.6 million women. Internal Walmart documents revealed patterns. Women made up over 70% of hourly workers, but only 33% of managers. They were paid less than men in every job category. The plaintiffs had the data, they had the testimonies, they had the proof. In 2011, the Supreme Court ruled against them, not on the merits, but on a technicality. The case was too big. You couldn't certify a class action of that size. Each woman would have to sue individually against a company with unlimited legal resources. The message was clear: become so large that the legal system can't hold you accountable. Then there are the labor violations. In 2000, Walmart faced a class action lawsuit for forcing employees to work off the clock, showing up early, staying late, skipping breaks, all unpaid. They settled for $50 million. In 2008, another lawsuit. Employees locked inside stores overnight, unable to leave even in emergencies. Settled. In 2012, the company paid $4.8 million to settle allegations they denied workers meal and rest breaks in California. These aren't isolated incidents. They're the business model. Cut labor costs to the absolute minimum. When you get caught, settle. Pay a fine. That's a rounding error on your quarterly profits, and keep doing it. The workers can't afford to keep fighting. Walmart can afford to keep settling. Meanwhile, Walmart employees are among the largest recipients of government assistance in America. A 2014 study found that Walmart workers rely on $6.2 billion in public assistance annually: food stamps, Medicaid, subsidized housing. The taxpayers subsidize Walmart's low wages, while the Waltons accumulate wealth that would take a Walmart worker making the median salary over 5 million years to earn. That's not capitalism, that's aristocracy. The Waltons aren't running stores anymore. They're barely involved in operations. They sit on boards, they manage foundations, they donate to political campaigns that protect their interests, they fund think tanks that produce research justifying low wages and opposing regulations. They've transformed retail dominance into a self-sustaining political machine. Sam Walton used to drive a pickup truck and cut his own hair at the local barber. He cultivated the image of a folksy Arkansas businessman. His heirs fly private jets and collect art worth hundreds of millions. Alice Walton opened a museum in Arkansas that cost over $100 million. Jim Walton owns a bank. Rob Walton's son-in-law bought the Denver Broncos for $4.6 billion. They're not small-town merchants anymore. They're an American dynasty built on a simple formula: pay workers as little as possible, sell products as cheaply as possible, and grow until you're too big to fail, too big to regulate, and too big to stop. And if you're wondering why American wages have stagnated while corporate profits soared, look at the Walmart model. Everyone else just copied it. The Sackler name used to mean something respectable. Walk into the Louvre, the Guggenheim, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You'd see it carved into walls, stamped on plaques, galleries bearing their name, wings funded by their donations. The Sacklers weren't just wealthy. They were cultured, philanthropic, tasteful. Then the bodies started piling up. The family fortune started with 3 brothers, Arthur Mortimer and Raymond Sackler, who bought a small pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick in 1952. Arthur was the genius, a psychiatrist who revolutionized pharmaceutical marketing. Before him, drug companies sold to doctors with facts and science. Arthur sold with emotion and repetition. Ads everywhere. Sales reps visiting doctors with gifts and talking points. He turned Valium into a household name in the 1960s, making it the first drug to reach $100 million in sales. He died in 1987, before the real money came, before OxyContin. His brothers and their descendants launched it in 1996. The pitch was revolutionary. A painkiller strong enough for cancer patients, but safe enough for chronic pain. Time-release formula, they said. 12 hours of relief. Less than 1% addiction risk, they claimed. That last part was a lie. Internal Purdue documents, revealed later in court, show they knew it was a lie from the beginning. They knew OxyContin's effects wore off before 12 hours. They knew patients would need higher doses. They knew it was wildly addictive. They marketed it anyway. Not just marketed, weaponized marketing. Purdue created a sales force that targeted the highest prescribing doctors with laser precision. They tracked prescriptions by doctor, by region, by specialty. Sales reps got bonuses for increasing opioid prescriptions in their territories. They were trained to overcome objections, to downplay addiction risks, to push higher doses. One training document told reps to reassure doctors that addiction was rare and easily treated. Another encouraged them to describe patients showing signs of addiction as merely exhibiting pseudo-addiction, a term Purdue helped popularize, suggesting patients just needed more drugs, not less. Doctors believed them. Why wouldn't they? This was a respected pharmaceutical company. The Sacklers had funded medical schools, endowed professorships, donated to hospitals. Their name was synonymous with medical philanthropy. By the early 2000s, OxyContin was everywhere. Rural communities, small towns, Appalachia, places where people worked physical jobs, had chronic pain, and trusted their doctors. Prescriptions flooded in. Pain clinics opened that were essentially legal drug dealers, prescribing hundreds of pills per patient. Purdue saw the pill mills. They got reports from their own sales reps about shady doctors. They kept shipping pills. The death toll is numbing. From 1999 to 2019, over 450,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Many started with a legal prescription for OxyContin or similar opioids. When the prescriptions ran out or became too expensive, they switched to heroin, then fentanyl. The progression was so common it had a name, the pipeline from prescription to street drugs. Entire communities were devastated. In West Virginia, children were born addicted. Foster care systems overflowed. Families buried their children. The economic damage ran into the hundreds of billions, healthcare costs, lost productivity, criminal justice expenses, treatment programs. The Sacklers got richer. Between 2008 and 2018 alone, they withdrew more than $10 billion from Purdue Pharma, moving money into offshore accounts, trusts, holding companies. They saw the lawsuits coming. They were preparing. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pled guilty in federal court to misleading doctors and patients about OxyContin's addiction risks. They paid $600 million. 3 executives paid fines. No one went to jail. The Sacklers personally? Not charged. Not named. Protected by corporate liability shields, the company kept selling OxyContin. By 2017, the walls were closing in. State after state filed lawsuits. Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey released documents showing the family's direct involvement, board meetings where they discussed pushing higher doses, targeting specific doctors, fighting any restrictions on prescribing. Richard Sackler, who ran Purdue, sent emails blaming overdose victims for their own deaths, calling them criminals and addicts who misused the medication. In 2019, Purdue declared bankruptcy. But this wasn't a normal bankruptcy. This was a weapon. The Sacklers offered a deal. They'd give up ownership of Purdue, contribute $4.5 billion over time, and turn the company into a public trust with profits going to addiction treatment. In exchange, they'd get complete immunity from all current and future opioid lawsuits. Read that again. They'd keep billions, admit no wrongdoing, and never face prosecution for their role in the deadliest drug crisis in American history. Thousands of victims' families objected. The judge approved it anyway in 2021. An appeals court overturned it in 2023, saying bankruptcy law couldn't grant immunity to people who hadn't declared bankruptcy themselves. The Supreme Court heard the case in 2024. Meanwhile, museums started removing the Sackler name. The Louvre took down the plaques. The Met stopped using their name for its wing. The Guggenheim followed, not because the money was returned, it wasn't, but because the name had become toxic. The Sacklers scattered to their mansions in New York, Connecticut, England, Gstaad. They're still billionaires, still protected by lawyers, still fighting in courts to preserve their fortune, and hundreds of thousands of Americans are still dead. This is what makes the Sackler story different from the others. The Kochs shaped policy, Murdoch shaped information, the Waltons shaped labor markets, but the Sacklers, they sold addiction for profit, documented the damage, and kept selling. They didn't just exploit a system, they created a crisis on purpose, for money, and they almost got away with it. Robert Mercer doesn't give interviews, doesn't appear on television, rarely speaks in public. At Renaissance Technologies, the most successful hedge fund in history, colleagues described him as brilliant, awkward, and so quiet that entire meetings would pass without him saying a word. But silence doesn't mean inaction. Mercer started as a computer scientist at IBM in the 1970s, working on early artificial intelligence and language recognition. In 1993, mathematician James Simons recruited him to Renaissance Technologies, a hedge fund that didn't rely on gut instinct or market intuition. They used algorithms, pure mathematics, computers analyzing patterns invisible to human traders. The results were obscene. Renaissance's Medallion Fund, available only to employees and select investors, generated average annual returns of 66% before fees from 1988 to 2018, 66% annually for 30 years. No other fund in history comes close. That kind of performance creates enormous wealth. By 2016, Mercer's personal fortune was estimated at over $1 billion. But here's what makes Mercer different from other billionaire hedge fund managers. He didn't just want to make money from the system, he wanted to reprogram it. The first hint came in 2010, when Mercer started donating to conservative political causes. Small amounts at first, then millions, then tens of millions. But unlike traditional Republican donors who backed establishment candidates, Mercer funded insurgents, outsiders, candidates the party establishment hated. In 2012, he poured money into a super PAC supporting Ted Cruz's Senate campaign. Cruz was a Tea Party firebrand who'd never held office. Mercer made him a senator. Then came 2016. Mercer's daughter, Rebecca, who'd taken an increasingly active role in political spending, had a theory. Donald Trump could win, but he'd need data, digital targeting, the kind of algorithmic precision her father used to beat markets. Enter Cambridge Analytica. Mercer invested $15 million in the company and joined its board. Cambridge Analytica promised psychological profiling on a mass scale. They claimed to have data on millions of Americans, personality types, fears, biases, vulnerabilities. They could micro-target political ads to exploit those psychological profiles, not persuade everyone, just move enough people in enough districts. They acquired their data through a Facebook app that harvested information not just from users who installed it, but from all their friends, over 87 million profiles total. Facebook later admitted the data harvesting violated their policies. By then, it was too late. Cambridge Analytica worked on Trump's 2016 campaign. They also worked on the Brexit campaign in Britain, another Mercer-funded operation. Both won, against all predictions, against all polls. How much Cambridge Analytica actually influenced those outcomes is debatable. What's not debatable? The Mercers funded an operation that harvested private data without consent to manipulate voters through psychological profiling. When journalists exposed it in 2018, Cambridge Analytica shut down. No criminal charges, just a company dissolved and a scandal that faded. But the Mercers' political operation went far beyond one data firm. Robert Mercer became the primary funder of Breitbart News after Andrew Breitbart's death in 2012. He installed Steve Bannon, a former Goldman Sachs banker turned right-wing provocateur, as executive chairman. Breitbart became the platform for the alt-right, pushing nationalist, anti-immigration, anti-establishment content that made Fox News look moderate. When Trump won, Bannon became chief strategist in the White House. The line between the Mercer political operation and the federal government disappeared entirely. Then there's the money trail the government investigated. In 2014, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations released a report on Renaissance Technologies' tax strategies. The findings were damning. Renaissance had used a strategy called basket options to disguise day trading as long-term investments. Day trading profits are taxed as ordinary income, up to 40%. Long-term capital gains are taxed at 20%. Renaissance's strategy let them trade billions daily while paying the lower rate. The IRS said it was fraudulent. The Senate report estimated Renaissance avoided $6.8 billion in taxes over 14 years. Not just Mercer, the whole fund. But Mercer, as co-CEO, was central to the strategy. Renaissance fought the IRS for years. In 2021, they settled, paying $470 million but admitting no wrongdoing. A slap on the wrist for a fund that had made tens of billions. Here's the pattern. Mercer used mathematical models to extract wealth from markets, then used that wealth to extract political outcomes, then used political influence to protect the system that made him wealthy. After the 2016 election, as scandals mounted, Mercer stepped back. He resigned as co-CEO of Renaissance, sold his stake in Breitbart, released a statement saying he'd been unfairly maligned, but the network didn't stop. Rebecca Mercer kept funding conservative causes. She was a major investor in Parler, the social media platform that became a haven for far-right content and played a role in organizing the January 6th Capitol attack. Apple and Google removed it from their app stores. Amazon cut off its web hosting. Parler went dark, then returned. The Mercers aren't ideologues in the traditional sense. They're engineers. They see politics as a system that can be hacked, data inputs, behavioral outputs, optimized for results. Democracy isn't sacred, it's code, and code can be rewritten. Robert Mercer is 77 now, out of the spotlight, back to his computers and his model trains. He's a serious model train collector, reportedly spending millions on his hobby, but his money is still in the system. His algorithms are still running. His daughter is still funding the network. The quietest billionaire on this list may have been the most dangerous because he proved something terrifying. You can use the tools of financial engineering to engineer political outcomes. And once that knowledge exists, it doesn't disappear. Here's where it gets interesting. These families don't operate in isolation. They orbit each other, their interests aligning in patterns you can trace through tax filings, donor lists, and board memberships. Start with the Koch network and the Mercers. Both funded Americans for Prosperity. Both bankrolled Tea Party infrastructure. Both invested heavily in the 2016 election cycle, supporting overlapping candidates and causes. When you map their political donations, the Venn diagram is nearly a circle. Opposing climate legislation, fighting labor unions, pushing tax cuts, funding the same think tanks and advocacy groups. The intellectual justification for their political goals often came from the same sources. The Cato Institute, co-founded by Charles Koch, produces research that benefits all wealthy families, arguing against estate taxes, capital gains taxes, regulation. The Mercatus Center, heavily Koch-funded, generates cost-benefit analyses that reliably conclude regulations cost more than they're worth. Convenient scholarship, consistently funded by those who benefit from its conclusions. Then there's the media layer. When the Sacklers were facing mounting opioid lawsuits, Murdoch's media outlets were remarkably restrained in their coverage. Fox News, which dedicates hours to culture war skirmishes, barely touched America's deadliest drug epidemic in its early years. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, which Murdoch controls, questioned whether the opioid crisis was really that bad, suggesting it was being exaggerated. Why? Perhaps because aggressive coverage of corporate malfeasance sets precedents. Today it's Purdue Pharma. Tomorrow it's Koch Industries, environmental violations, or Walmart's labor practices, or News Corp's editorial decisions. The wealthy protect each other not through conspiracy, but through aligned interests. Look at tax policy. Every family on this list benefits from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Koch's network spent millions lobbying for it. The Mercers funded candidates who voted for it. Murdoch's media championed it. The Waltons' vast wealth became even more sheltered from state taxes. And the cuts were designed to sunset for working families while remaining permanent for corporations. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. Or consider their philanthropic overlap. They sit on the same museum boards, fund the same universities, attend the same elite gatherings. The Council on Foreign Relations lists Murdoch as a member. David Koch was a trustee at multiple museums where Sackler money flowed. These aren't secret cabals. They're documented board memberships, public donor lists, society pages. But those relationships matter. When you share a table at a museum fundraiser, when your foundations fund the same think tank, when your political operatives move between your organizations, you don't need to coordinate. You just naturally align. The web isn't a conspiracy. It's something more mundane and more powerful. Overlapping interest groups with shared goals, similar ideologies, and the resources to reshape policy in their favor. They don't control everything. They don't need to. They just need to control enough. Enough media to shape narratives. Enough political funding to influence legislation. Enough think tanks to provide intellectual cover. Enough lawyers to avoid accountability. And they do. So what does all this concentrated power actually do to the rest of us? Start with your paycheck. Since 1979, worker productivity has increased 64%. Wages? Up just 17%, adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, CO compensation rose over 1,000%. That gap didn't happen naturally. It happened through policy, weakened unions, eroded labor protections, tax structures favoring capital over work, policy shaped by the lobbying operations we just documented. The Waltons pay poverty wages while accumulating dynastic wealth. Walmart workers subsidize the family fortune with food stamps funded by taxpayers. That's not a bug in the system. That's the system working exactly as designed by those who funded the politicians who wrote the laws. Then there's what you know, or think you know. When one family controls major news outlets across multiple countries, they control what gets covered and what gets buried. The opioid crisis killed more Americans than the Vietnam War, but it took years to get sustained national media attention. Why? Because aggressive coverage of corporate malfeasance creates precedent. Media companies are corporations too. They have aligned interests with other corporations. You get the news that doesn't threaten the system producing it. Climate policy is another casualty. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus, action stalls. Koch-funded think tanks produce doubt. Mercer-backed politicians deny the science. Murdoch's media platforms give equal time to fringe theories and established fact, creating the illusion of debate where none exists in the scientific community. Meanwhile, Koch Industries keeps refining oil, and the planet keeps warming. The political system itself warps under the weight of their money. The candidate you voted for? Their campaign was funded by super PACs backed by family fortunes. The bill they introduced? written by lobbyists paid by corporate interests. The appointment they confirmed? Someone who'll spend 3 years in government, then take a 7-figure job at the company they just regulated. You vote. But the options you're voting for were filtered through a system designed by those with the resources to shape it. And perhaps most insidious, the opioid crisis proved you can kill hundreds of thousands of Americans for profit, document the damage in your own internal communications, and still negotiate immunity through bankruptcy court. Accountability disappeared somewhere around the billion-dollar mark. This isn't democracy failing. This is democracy operating under conditions it was never designed to handle, where wealth concentration gives a handful of families more power than millions of voters combined. Here's the uncomfortable truth. None of this is hidden. It's all in the public record. Court documents, tax filings, congressional testimony, investigative journalism. The information is available. Most people just don't have time to connect the dots between a settlement in Texas, a think tank paper in Virginia, a media acquisition in New York, and the legislation that passes in Washington at 2 a.m. That's the genius of modern power. It's not a conspiracy. It's a system so complex, so diffuse, so wrapped in legitimate-sounding institutions that by the time you trace the money from a Coke donation to a think tank to a model bill to a state legislature, people's eyes have glazed over. We're not designed to think systematically about systemic problems. We think in stories, heroes, and villains. The system doesn't give us that. It gives us complexity, legal structures, philanthropic foundations with noble-sounding names. The 5 families we've examined aren't cartoon villains. They're rational actors optimizing for their interests in a system that allows, even encourages, wealth to translate into political power. They're not breaking the rules. They're using the rules they helped write. And that's what makes this so difficult to fix. You can't vote out a system when the people funding the candidates benefit from the system staying exactly as it is. You can't regulate industries when the regulators are chosen by politicians funded by those industries. You can't get accurate information when the media platforms are owned by people with interests to protect. Democracy assumes a level playing field. It assumes that one person, one vote, actually means something. But what happens when some people can afford to fund think tanks that shape what others think? When they can buy media platforms that determine what millions believe? When they can hire armies of lobbyists to write the laws that govern everyone? This isn't the America we learn about in civics class. But it's the America that exists in practice. 5 families, hundreds of billions of dollars, decades of accumulated influence. They didn't seize power through force. They purchased it legally, one donation at a time, one acquisition at a time, one carefully placed board member at a time. And the most terrifying part? The system they built protects itself. That room we started with, the one you'll never see, where decisions get made that shape your life, it's not going anywhere. If this documentary opened your eyes to how power actually operates in America, hit that subscribe button. We're pulling back the curtain on financial corruption, exposing the systems most people never see. Drop a comment. Which family surprised you most? What connections did we miss? And here's the real question. If you knew all this before you voted, before you bought, before you trusted, would you have made different choices? That's why this channel exists. To give you the information they'd prefer you didn't have. See you in the next investigation.